there's, they talk about labor bureaucracy. They're not communists or revolutionaries. They want to see their dues money go up. So the more people who join their union, the more money they get. The better conditions those workers have, the more dues money they're going to get. So they more or less see it as their bread and butter, and they don't want to take any risks because they don't want to lose their position, right? That's one big thing about the labor bureaucracy, right? They're not going to call out the workers to all go on strike, because if the union falls apart, then they don't get a paycheck anymore. And many people have talked about how, to a lot of working class people, there almost seems to be no difference between the labor bureaucracy and the bosses, right? The labor bureaucrats, you look at some of these people high up in the AFL-CIO and the big unions, the amount of money that they're making, the amount of money your boss, the owner of the factory is making, sometimes they're comparable, right? And that, labor bureaucrats wear suits, they sound like politicians. And that's been one of the big efforts to demonize labor unions in the United States, has been this effort to say, well, look, this is a business. Labor unions are ripping you off. They're exploiting you. But the reality is that a labor bureaucrat has a very different relationship to you than your employer, right? Your employer gets more money the less money they pay you, whereas the labor bureaucrat gets more money the more money they pay you, right? Think about it, right? Very different relationship. Your employer wants to squeeze every last penny out of you they can to maximize their own profits. The labor boss, the labor bureaucrat, has the opposite desire, right? He wants you to make as much money as he possibly can so that he can make sure that his dues money increases, right? It's a different kind of relationship. But the labor bureaucracy, the history of the communist movement, you read William Z. Foster and all that, they've held back revolutionary struggles, right? We know that the AFL Union, the American Federation of Labor, was at one point very, very racist, right? Whites only. I mean, they didn't have black people in their unions. At one point, the AFL had a policy of not organizing people they deemed to be unskilled, right? All these immigrants in the United States were in places like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Cleveland, and they were low-income Irish folks, Eastern European folks, African Americans from the South. They're working in these factories, and the AFL wouldn't organize them because they said, oh, they're unskilled workers. And the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is only for skilled craftsmen, right? They would organize pipe fitters, they would organize plumbers, they would organize construction trades, but no. If you're on an assembly line making cars, an assembly line making steel, we don't want you, right? That was their policy. The labor bureaucracy is famous for being conservative, right? The father of American labor bureaucracy was a man named Samuel Gompers. And what's interesting is that Samuel Gompers was originally a communist, right? He was a Marxist originally, an American guy. But then, when the class struggle bogged down, he became the head of the AFL. He was the founder of the American Federation of Labor, and he disavowed communism, disavowed Marxism, and he supported imperialist wars, and he had a policy, no politics in the union. He pushed to ban communists and radicals from the labor unions, right? I mean, there's a whole history of that. But then we know the AFL existed, the American Federation of Labor, and the Wobblies, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, came into existence. And they organized industrial workers, aka workers that were labeled by the AFL to be unskilled. And at the time, in the teens and 20s, there were a lot of lumberjacks, people that cut down trees, coal miners, people like that. The AFL wouldn't organize them, so the Wobblies did. The IWW would organize them. And the IWW, their slogan was one big union, because they said anyone who sells their labor to survive, the workers, should be in one big union. That was what made them different. And the AFL didn't like the Wobblies. They thought they were extremists and radicals, and the Wobblies thought the AFL were a bunch of sellouts and phonies. They called the AFL all kinds of nasty names and all of that. And as I mentioned, William Z. Foster was a guy who was a wobbly, right? He was in the IWW, but he said this strategy, we ought to go into the AFL and infiltrate it. And he was successful in doing that. In Chicago, William Z. Foster was able to maneuver within the AFL to organize the meatpacking workers all across the Chicago, these packing houses where people were packing meat, right, and cutting meat, and he organized those folks. A lot of them were Eastern European folks, and he organized them into a union. He eventually got a steel strike going, and he did this within the AFL by maneuvering it. And a lot of the early communists didn't like William Z. Foster at first because he had done that, right? Because they said that the They said that because Foster was in the AFL, he was a sellout. He should be building the IWW. And if you watch the movie Reds, starring Warren Beatty, they kind of distort that dispute. But the thing was that the Soviet, the Soviet Union and the Communist International was urging communists to go into the big AFL, not try to build an alternative communist union. But the reality was, William Z. Foster was right? The AFL had millions of people. The Wobblies were 100,000 maybe. I mean, it just wasn't the right thing to do. Strategically, the communists needed to go into the big union. And eventually, that worked. Now, in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution, the AFL got really big in cracking down on communists. It banned any communist from being in the union. There's a story of the AFL convention in the 1920s, right? They had the national convention. William Z. Foster was in the audience. And Samuel Gompers, the head of the labor union, points to William Z. Foster. That man is who we want nothing like. He is a communist and a radical, right? And if anyone was known to be a communist and they were in the AFL, they got kicked out. And that the Trade Union Educational League that was run by the Communist Party, they had to operate within the AFL unions very, very secretly. Right? And because if you were found out to be a communist, you were automatically kicked out of your union. Right? And even now, when anyone joins a labor union, they have to sign something saying they don't agree with dual unionism. And that was a way to prevent communist unions from existing inside of AFL unions. All a crazy thing. But that all changed. Right? So in the 1930s, right, when the Great Depression got going, the communists, they stopped trying to work in the AFL and they formed something called the TUUL, the Trade Union Unity League. And it was a federation of communist unions. And what they did is they started organizing workers who the AFL wouldn't organize. Black people in the South, right? The AFL did not believe in organizing people of color. So the communists, TUUL, started organizing black people and sharecroppers into the TUUL, the Trade Union Unity League. The TUUL tried to form an auto workers union in Detroit. The TUUL had a lot of struggles, right? And miners in Pennsylvania. And the Trade Union Unity League was an attempt to organize the unorganized in a communist union. And it was successful. The only problem was that often with the right-wing, AFL unions, they would be the enemies of the union. They would break the union. They'd bring in scabs. They'd work against it because they didn't like the communists. But then things changed. 1934 was a big turning point. 1934 was really the year that made the American labor movement. 1934, you had in San Francisco, the Communist Party USA led the big strike, right? The dock workers strike that shut down the docks of San Francisco, right? And that was Harry Bridges. That was Samuel Darcy. And they led the dock workers strike. They shut down the docks. And previously, when there had been dock workers strikes, the African Americans would be used as scabs, right? They would just hire black people to work on the docks. But they didn't do that this time because the Communist Party was so respected in the black community. And the labor union, led by the communists, made hiring black people one of the principal demands of the strike, that if the union was recognized, they would hire African Americans. So instead of the black community being brought in as scabs on the strike, the black community were biggest supporters of the strike. Anti-racism was how, in San Francisco, the Communist Party organized the docks. And when they went on strike, the big strike, the summer of 1934, was huge. And people died, and it was a big battle. But ultimately, out of it, you got the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU. That same summer, in Minneapolis, the Trotskyites had infiltrated the Teamsters Union. And the truck drivers in Minneapolis who delivered all the trucks, all the stuff to the stores, right? All in Minneapolis, like in any other city, they had trucks that delivered the milk and the supplies, and so the Teamsters, union was the union of the truck drivers, and the Trotskyites had formed a faction within the Teamsters, and they had organized a strike of all truck drivers in Minneapolis, and they actually had a policy during this strike. They said no scab trucks. And so any truck that didn't have a union pass in the window would get busted open because they'd be out there with baseball bats, and no scab trucks. And they shut down the city of Minneapolis. There's a big famous banner, "Make Minneapolis a Union Town." And it worked, right? And the Teamsters shut down Minneapolis. They set up big speakers over the town, and they would broadcast every night radical labor speeches. And the Trotskyites, via the Teamsters Union, kind of took over Minneapolis until the bosses were forced to sign a contract. People died. Machine gun fire was exchanged. It was a battle in the streets of Minneapolis. In Toledo, Ohio, there was Auto Light, which was an electrical power company. And the workers at Autolite went on strike, and they were part of the Communist Party, a lot of them, and they were also in something called the American Workers' Party, which was a weird kind of social democratic group. And they went on strike, and the National Guard was sent in, and it was a battle. That was the summer of 1934. And then, let's add, all over the South. All over the South, you had textile factories where people, made cloth and such. And all over the South, workers that were black and white in the textile mills in South Carolina and Alabama and Georgia, they also went out on strike. And a lot of them died, and it was a battle. 1934, the summer of 1934. I wrote an article about it years ago. 1934, the year American workers fought back, was a pivotal year in the history of the United States. I don't know of any other year where there has been that intense class struggle in the United States. It was intense. 3 major cities in the United States were basically taken over by communist unions, right, and shut down with general strikes. All across the South, you had uprisings, and like a national emergency was just a general emergency was declared in the state of South Carolina, and all over the country, you had these battles going on, and it was in that context that Roosevelt passed the Wagner Act of 1935, the next year, that made it legal to go on strike. In most states throughout the United States, it was illegal to go on strike. It was illegal to be in a union, right? It was considered to be, striking was, disrupting public order. Well, 1935, the Democrats passed the Wagner Act and then tried to get all these workers that were in communist unions to join the AFL. So at that point, the communists had the strategy of going into the AFL. But there was something within the AFL. There was the leader of the miners' union, John L. Lewis, who was the leader of the miners' union. He led a faction in the AFL called the Committee for Industrial Organization, CIO. And he was saying to the AFL that they shouldn't just organize, quote, skilled workers. They should organize the steel workers and the craftsmen and all of that. The AFL, they had a very big convention. And John L. Lewis, got up and punched some leader of the AFL union. Punched him and just punched him, right? And walked out. He punched, and formed this new union federation called the CIO, Congress for Industrial Organizations. And the CIO became the group that led the sit-down strike wave and did all of this. And very famously, in Flint, Michigan, right? They had the sit-down strike of Flint, Michigan, where the auto workers thought they were going to lose their jobs. So they occupied their factory and refused to leave. And John L. Lewis, the leader of the miners' union, showed up in front of the factory, and he ripped open his shirt and said, if they're going to shoot anyone, they're going to have to shoot me. And John L. Lewis, this guy with big eyebrows, right? Eastern European heritage, I believe, big man, and he organized the CIO. And what made the CIO different than the AFL was the CIO didn't have a ban on communists. The AFL had a ban on communists. The CIO did not. And they started hiring Communist Party members left and right in order to unionize. And they led the sit-down strike wave, and that was the CIO. And it was eventually in the 1950s when federal law, they had the Taft-Hartley law, made it illegal for any communist to be a member of a labor union. And so because of the Taft-Hartley law, the CIO also kicked out communists, and eventually they merged into the AFL-CIO. And that's the big labor federation in the United States. Now, there's also something called Change to Win, which I believe is led by Andy Stern, who was the founder of SEIU and was like an SDS radical back in the day and a friend of Barack Obama. I mean, this is the labor movement. I'm not in a union. I'm not, I don't have anything to do with that. I'm just telling you what I've read in history, right? The labor movement is not where I'm at. I've done zero work in the labor movement. When I was in college, when the Republic of Window and Doors strike happened, me and my roommate and a few other young people from Cleveland, we drove to Chicago to support the Republic Window and Door Makers Union. So we did a little bit of, but that's not my field of expertise, right? The labor stuff is not my field of expertise at all. I'm just telling you what I've read. So, when you talk about the labor movement, the sit-down strike wave, the communists in the labor movement, right, the main opponent of the unions is always the bosses, but then the communists have always felt like the labor bosses are also their opponent, right? The labor bosses, they would prefer not to do anything too risky. They don't really want socialism. They just kind of want their union to expand. So that's the whole history there, and I hope that answers the question from Mr. Daniel Fox.